Welcome to the National Security Risk and Responsibility Panel. My name is Jennifer Griffin, and I've covered the Pentagon for Fox News since 2007. Today, my esteemed panel will address future threats, especially the role of cyber warfare and the threat it poses to commerce, infrastructure, and perhaps what is most on our minds today, U.S. elections. We'll ask the question, has great power competition superseded concerns about terrorism? We will have a full-throated debate for the next hour about the next generation of emerging threats. And with that, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panel. Jay Johnson, former Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, will be joining us shortly. Congressman Seth Moulton, an Iraq war veteran representing the great state of Massachusetts and a key member of the House Armed Services Committee, is here with us today, as is Mira Ricardel, former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Trump. She served with Ambassador John Bolton and is now at the Chertoff Group. And Dmitry Alperovich, former Chief Technology Officer at CrowdStrike. Something that has struck me this week, on Monday, we celebrated marked the 20th anniversary of the USS Coal Strike, in which 17 American sailors were killed when a small boat, a dhow with two terrorists and filled with explosives, pulled up alongside that U.S. Navy destroyer in Yemen. It was, many thought, the first shot in the global war on terror. It was missed by many in the national security establishment. The U.S. did not respond. And I've often thought since then that often there are events that we miss as national security experts that really are the precursor to the next war. Many have said that bin Laden was hoping the U.S. would respond at that time to the coal strike and was waiting for a response. And when he didn't receive one in Afghanistan, that's when the planning for 9/11 forward. So with that, I'd like to open up to my panelists. I'd like to get their thoughts about what are the threats, what are the emerging threats that we're not paying attention to? What are we not seeing right now that are likely to be either a future war or a future conflict that we are missing? Why don't we start with you, Congressman Moulton?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for having me this morning. I'm delighted to start with this question because I just finished a task force on the future of defense, which is the first time that the House Armed Services Committee, really, or the Senate Armed Services Committee, has taken a look 30 years out in a very long time to try to understand what the future threats are to our national security and how we need to prepare for them today. We're very proud of the fact that we do a defense bill every year, but that almost necessitates that we're always looking 12 months ahead. And so we tried to take a long view, and we developed a bipartisan report, which I think is somewhat remarkable given the divisions in Washington today. We've made it very clear that China is the #1 long-term threat, and that we're falling behind in a number of technology areas, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and one that I think we don't talk about enough, which is biotechnology. Now, you probably think that I'm bringing up biotech because we're in the midst of a pandemic. But that's actually a very conventional thinking of biotech as it might be used in warfare. What I'm talking about is a future world where the revolution, the technology revolution is no longer the infotech revolution, but the biotech revolution. And we use biotech not just to cure diseases, but to literally manufacture things. It becomes an essential new technology for the future of the planet. And China has made it very clear that they intend to win this race. Because of some peculiarities about biotech, and specifically the techniques within biotech that are used for manufacturing, it's going to be hard for there to be a second place finisher. It's sort of like if you have Google as the #1 search engine, and you go to someone and say, well, use my search engine because it's the second best. No one's going to want to do that. They still want to use Google. And by the way, every time someone else uses Google, it makes it a little bit better. Much is the same with the way biotech works. The benefits accrue to the winner. And so if we lose this race, and China is the world leader in using biotech for everything from creating, for manufacturing at a nanoscale to dealing with the next pandemic, then we are going to be very behind economically and in terms of national security. So I think that an example of something that we don't think about today is the role of biotechnology specifically in national security. And we have to invest today to win that race if we don't want to see China be the victor in 20 years.
Thank you, Congressman Milken. Mira, why don't we go to you next? What are we missing?
So I think one of the things that I've taken out of this pandemic situation is no one anticipated the disruptions that we would have in food and PPE and medicine. And it made me think, well, where else do we have dependencies that we haven't completely appreciated? And that is our dependency on space and satellites. And what would be the impact on our country if we lost communications networks that were critical, or financial networks? What would happen? How would we deal with that? Do we have resiliency in space? Are we spending enough time thinking about how to protect our satellites against the growing threat from China and from Russia? I mean, the Pentagon's recent report out in September, its annual report on Chinese military power, really spoke to the resources that China's putting into anti-satellite capability and into trying to dominate space. And a corollary to that is, and as you brought up in your introduction, is cyber. What would happen if we had a cyber attack on a power grid? Are we prepared? Do we have the backup equipment ready to repair those grids and to get power to those who are affected? So that brings me then to the final thought on this, which is, do we really understand our supply chains and our supply chain vulnerabilities as well? And what do we need to do to be prepared, whether it's for the next pandemic, to defend against cyber attack, and to protect our satellite networks? I think we have a lot of challenges there that could just get us by surprise, much like this pandemic did as well.
Dimitri, what do you see? What are we missing right now? What are you seeing? What's the future look like?
No, thank you, Jennifer. I want to echo the comments from Congressman Mira. Completely agree with that. I think when you look at the threats that we face, the number one threat, I think, unquestionably for this century is the threat of the rise in China and the belligerence that the Chinese are expressing increasingly day by day. But we've actually been in what I believe is an economic war with China for the last 20 years that we've only just now begun to recognize. The fact of the matter is that for the last 20 years, in every area of technology, biotech, as the congressman had mentioned, but also technology, agriculture, you name it, virtually every single sector, the Chinese have targeted via cyber mechanisms to penetrate US companies and other Western companies and to steal intellectual property from those companies. And that is why you're now starting to see the emergence of the behemoths like Huawei and others in China that have, in large parts, been subsidized by the Chinese government, both in the research and development phase of their operations, but also in the theft of intellectual property that has been conducted by the Chinese state and their contractors against Western firms. So I think that is a fundamental problem that we face right now. More targeted, to Mira's point, is really the vulnerability of our telecommunications. And yes, I completely agree with Mira. Vulnerability of satellites is a real problem, but also the underwater sea cables. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of our internet communications that across the world go through these undersea cables that are under the ice, and it is increasingly becoming easier for our adversaries like Russia and China to tap into those cables, to sever them at a moment of crisis, to wiretap them. So that's a huge, huge concern. And of course, what we've seen from this administration is the aggressive push to make sure that the Chinese suppliers of telecommunications equipment like Huawei and ZTE cannot embed their technologies both in the US networks, but also the networks of our allies, because at a moment of crisis, they can easily turn those technologies off and essentially make everything go dark.
Dimitri, let me follow up by asking you about, obviously CrowdStrike was at the forefront of determining the threat to the US election in 2016. What are you seeing right now in terms of cyber threats, the role of disinformation in this campaign? How is it different from 2016?
That's a great question, Jennifer. And I think there's always an interest in the national security community in looking back and fighting the last war. And the reality is that 2020 is very, very different from 2016. Just a reminder to everyone, we're now sitting in the middle of October. By this time in 2016, we had already seen the hack of the DNC and the leak of those documents. We had seen the hack of the DCCC and the leak of those documents in August of 2016. And by now, in 2016, the Podesta emails have already been released as well. So obviously, we haven't seen any of that activity this year. It's not to say that it may not happen, but the clock is ticking, and we're just a few weeks away from the election now. So it's increasingly difficult for someone to organize and actually perpetrate these types of activities. So I do think it's fundamentally different. The disinformation campaigns have continued, and in fact, they're no longer tied to just election cycles. The Russians and now the Iranians and the Chinese have been aggressively developing capabilities to infiltrate social media platforms, to develop networks of fake accounts, to push their messages. And those messages are now part of our everyday life. And they're trying to divide us. They're trying to push their propaganda, amplifying domestic voices as well. So that really is not going away anytime soon. I think it's the new normal and not necessarily tied to elections. But what worries me the most personally about the security of our elections is actually a ransomware attack on the infrastructure itself. The reality is that our elections are run by local officials, local municipalities and counties, and they're very, very vulnerable. The federal government is doing a lot to try to help them, but the federal government has limited capability in this area because constitutionally, they're not the ones that are actually running elections. And if a ransomware attack that is able to lock down systems on the day of the election occurs, you could have confusion, you can have long lines. If the election officials can't verify voters because the voter registration databases or the poll books are locked down. So that's what worries me the most. And those types of attacks don't have to happen from nation states. They can happen from cyber criminal groups. Ransomware and cyber is now the number one scourge that every organization out there is dealing with, and particularly states and municipalities.
And that's certainly what we saw this week with the role that...
I've joined by phone.
Oh, great. Okay, Secretary Johnson, thank you for joining us. I'll go back to our first question. What is the threat that we're not paying attention to that has you most worried right now?
Well, first, let me apologize for being late. Technical difficulties on my end here in New York. The threat that I worry about most that we're not paying sufficient attention to, let's put aside for the moment COVID, which I view as a national security threat. And there are many, including myself, who say that we have not done enough at the national level to address it. Let's put aside what Dimitri has just been talking about, which is also a very, very significant concern of mine. Within the spirit of your question, I think the number one threat that we are failing to address is, frankly, global warming, climate change. I don't know whether that's been discussed so far in this program, but it is a slow motion threat, as Barack Obama used to refer to. It never makes it to priority number one for our national security officials because it is a slow-moving threat. But it is the number one challenge I think we face as a nation and as a global community, and we are not doing what we need to do. We are not paying sufficient attention to the problem, though we see evidence of the problem increasingly day by day.
That's an excellent point, and we haven't addressed it yet. I think if I would like to also draw the panel's attention and get your thoughts on the fact that maybe the greatest threat we're facing is domestic and not an international threat. You also, you really, what concerns me is looking at how divided the population is and how we no longer share a set of facts. If you're talking about climate change, there's not an agreement, and these parallel parts of our electorate that are being reinforced with information that can be disinformation or can be just the facts that they're choosing to hear in their echo chambers. I feel that that is an internal threat that we need to address. Let me go to Congressman Milken. we saw that Microsoft, there was news that Microsoft teamed up with Cyber Command and did try to take some of these TrickBot and others, these cyber criminals offline. And we also saw the unprecedented situation where Twitter and Facebook blocked certain posts, news posts this week. Should tech companies be doing more? Are we now seeing them doing more? And is that what is different about this time around this election? Congressman Moulton, let's start with you.
Absolutely. Well, yes, tech companies should be doing more. They are doing more than they've done in the past, but I don't think it's nearly enough. But look, we've got to look ourselves in the mirror here at the federal government, especially in Congress, and recognize that it's incumbent upon us to establish some of these regulations and guidelines for what they should be doing. I won't use his name, but a rather famous, sometimes infamous tech CEO told me once, Seth, at the end of the day, do you want me and a bunch of 25-year-olds sitting in a dark room deciding what should and should not be censored on our platform? Or do you think that elected officials should fundamentally establish the guidelines and the rules? And his point was well taken, that it really is our job as elected officials to set the guidelines and then work with the tech companies as appropriate to make sure that those are enforced. I want to also just take this opportunity to comment on a couple of the things that Dimitri said about the election, because he makes a very good point that we seem to overall be in a much better place in 2020 than we were in 2016. I would add that it's not just in terms of what specific attacks we're seeing externally, but also we have made our internal election infrastructure much more robust. But I'd caveat that by saying that it's not for lack of trying on Russia's part that they have been as effective at infiltrating the process here. We've gotten much better at our defensive capabilities, and Russia, frankly, has been trying very hard. We've just been able to thwart them. But the other issue is that a lot of other, both nations and groups like QAnon, we've seen in the news a lot lately, have taken up Russia's playbook. And my concern is not just that we'll see some October surprise a few days before the election, but that they will play right into the president's clear strategy of questioning the election results after Election Day. I think that if you look at the polls right now and the propensity of Democrats to vote by mail, but Republicans to vote in person, it's very easy to foresee a scenario where Trump and other Republicans are ahead on election night. But as more mail-in ballots come in, it becomes clear that Democrats take the advantage. But if the president is effective at sowing dissension and concern about the validity of those results in the days immediately following the election, and if Russia or other actors like QAnon are able to play into that, then we could see a serious crisis for democracy right after the election, not just leading up to it. So I remain very concerned about the potential cyber issues here going into the election. And I think we're all going to have to be vigilant. And the fact, as you say, that this country is so divided obviously just makes this all worse because we're not dealing with a set of facts. And to the Secretary's point about climate change, it was pretty disheartening to hear Amy Coney Bryant before the Senate talk about climate change as a political issue, as something that she didn't feel that she should comment on because it's politically divisive. The facts are not divisive. Science is not at issue here. The science is very clear. Scientists are all aligned. And certainly a nominee for the Supreme Court ought to be able to talk about facts and science and rise above the politics to just state the case as it is, in this case, the serious concern with climate change.
Mira, let me turn to you because you were on the National Security Council, you led it. I'm curious as to why you got rid of the position of cybersecurity czar, but also talk to us about Cyber Command and how under the Trump administration, Cyber Command has been given more authorities than they had perhaps during the Obama administration. And how are you feeling right now in terms of what you're seeing in terms of threats to the election?
So thank you, Jennifer. I would just say in terms of the personnel decisions that were made, I think the focus was much more on, what the objective and vision and mission was, as opposed to people's titles. A lot of people have the titles of czars from administration to administration, and it doesn't necessarily affect the outcome one way or another. I do think the biggest thing that was accomplished was to come up with an updated security strategy, which took into effect the new ways that the internet and of things was being utilized in cyberspace as a whole, was not just an afterthought, but is a real battlefield for our adversaries. And so I think the cyber strategy needed updating. That was done. The other thing that had to be done is had to be a recognition that you can't just play defense in cyber. And you had to give Cyber Command in particular some of the flexibility to take offensive action if it thought that it needed to do so. And so I think that was a sea change from the prior administration, which took largely defensive action and took it sometimes in a very slow way. So getting the entire government together, the agencies, whether it's Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, coming up with what the parameters are for addressing certain kinds of threats, I think that was a significant accomplishment. That said, I just want to go back to the point on disinformation divisions internally to this country. Who benefits from that? I mean, essentially, it's our adversaries. And so I think we need to be aware that Russia and China are playing in this field because they want to create instability. And they're not just doing it here. They're doing it in Central and East Europe. They're doing it elsewhere. They want to undermine democracy and democratic processes because because democracy is a threat to their own rule within China or within Russia. So I think we need to see that this is not just a domestic issue, disinformation, misinformation, but that there are a lot of players, and it's not just going to be Russia and China, it could be North Korea and Iran as well. So all in all, cyberspace is with us. We need to have effective policies and processes and capabilities that evolve as the threat evolves. And part of that is going to be also the supply chain security, ensuring that we're doing everything we can, especially when we're talking about software, to close any kind of backdoors that China or Russia could be using to get into our software supply chain, which frankly was developed largely commercially without a thought to real security. And so we've got a lot of work to do there.
And Mira, just to follow up, are you seeing any examples of disinformation that is being pushed into the public sphere of late? Any concrete examples you can point to that have you concerned?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of, I think it's hard to say where some of these things that happen here are generated, but we certainly saw it with elections that occurred overseas. We saw the Russians very active in Montenegro in the past. I don't have specific examples of groups here that are, let's say, backed by China or Russia that I would be able to talk about. But I would say that at the end of the day, we know that there are that bots are involved, that there is a lot of aggravation of already tense situations by foreign intervention.
And Secretary Johnson, I'll pose the same question to you. Is there disinformation that you are seeing or examples of Russian interference that you can point to? And what role do media companies have in elevating that disinformation at this moment in time? What are your concerns?
Where do I begin? First, we could be in the depths of a misinformation campaign right now as we speak. And we may not fully appreciate it for another 6 to 12 or 18 months. Given the nature of a disinformation campaign, you can't always recognize it real time. And if you look at the intelligence assessments from ODNI that were put out in late July, early August. They cite the threat to our democracy from Russia and, to a lesser extent, in my view, China and Iran, the threat to our election infrastructure, the threat to the hacking into campaigns, and the larger disinformation campaign. And these intelligence assessments indicate that the Russians in particular are active in all three. And I'll point to the statement that Jim Clapper and I issued 4 years ago. 4 years ago, on October 7th, we were able to know that the Russians had hacked into the DNC. We were very concerned about the scanning and probing we saw around election infrastructure, but we were not then in a position to even begin to grasp the extent of the disinformation campaign that was going on, that was subsequently laid out in the Mueller indictment. And so we could be in the midst of something right now, and I suspect that we are. I think the major difference between 2016 and now is much of the disinformation has domestic origins, and therefore the Russians can perhaps have the luxury of stepping back and, perhaps just being aiders and abettors of the activity rather than the origins of it. You ask about the media. I think that the media, and we're starting to see this in social media now to a greater extent, needs to do a much better job of calling out what we all can clearly recognize in real time as fake news and putting that label on it. But at the end of the day, also, Jennifer, it's on the American public, it's on ourselves to be a little more skeptical about some of the stuff that gets shoveled at us at a daily basis. And I think it's incumbent upon informed citizens, and I believe there is an obligation to be informed, particularly in an election season, to apply a little more skepticism to what we see, what we read, and not just accept, and social media tempts us to do this, not just accept the headline of a story. Apply a little more skepticism and thinking and rationality to what we're seeing and hearing. So I think there's a role for all of us to play in being a better, more informed democracy in the midst of the campaign that we're probably seeing right now.
And Dimitri, talk to us a little bit about what Microsoft has done of late, Twitter, Facebook. How unusual is it for them to team up with U.S. Cyber Command? What has changed in that realm, and is that enough? And give us a few examples, please.
I think that's an excellent point, Jennifer. And I actually want to clarify something because in some ways this is highlighting both the great things that the private sector and the government are doing, but it also highlights the challenges, because what actually happened last week in the takedown of this TrickBot botnet that is responsible for most of the most prevalent ransomware attacks that have been taking place from Russian-speaking criminals, is that both Cyber Command and Microsoft had taken those actions independently, aware of each other, but without close coordination. And I think that actually is part of the problem, that what is missing in this domain, in cyber in particular, is for the federal government to finally realize that this is a fundamentally different national security domain from what they're used to dealing with. They're used to dealing with sort of the Cold War style mentality where the federal government in the United States is confronting adversaries, intelligence services from foreign countries, and this is a domain of government. That is not the case in cyber. The private sector has enormous capabilities, enormous intelligence capacity to collect information, to understand what the adversaries are doing, oftentimes before the federal government. In 2016, as Jay Johnson knows really well, the private sector was the one that actually originally discovered the hack of the DNC, my own company. And it was only months later that the government had come forward and actually acknowledged that this had taken place. So the reality is that what we need is for actually the federal government to lead, to establish a CONOPS plan, a plan of operation of how we're going to confront these adversaries, nation-state adversaries and cyber criminals, and bring the private sector the platform companies like Microsoft and Google and others, as well as the cybersecurity company and others that can bring a lot of capability to bear on this problem under the direction and guidance of the federal government. And that is what we're unfortunately missing today.
Great. Congressman Moulton, I want to turn to you, and I want to turn the discussion now to China as not only an emerging threat, but are we at this moment in time, based on what the panel is seeing, are we in a 1914 moment where we're seeing two powers, a rising power and a fading power, headed for a potential hot war, not a Cold War, but a hot war? Is this England and Germany, 1914? Where do you see the relationship with China heading? Congressman Moulton, let's start with you. You expressed concerns about the biotech sphere and the supply chains, but talk more about China as a rising power.
Well, absolutely. Look, the threat is very real, and it is a threat of a hot war, not just a Cold War. But this is a very unique time in a lot of ways too, because our economies are so intertwined. Global commerce, just in general, is so interdependent. And I think that that America is in some ways being caught asleep at the switch here, not paying attention to the massive investments that China is making in future technologies and in the ways that they are trying to circumvent some of the things that, including just the simple defense strategies that we have taken for granted for a long time. So in other words, to put this in more concrete terms, they don't look at our aircraft carrier fleet and say, if we're going to compete with America, we have to build 15 or 20 aircraft carriers. They're much more focused on just building the weapons to defeat them. Yes, they are building some aircraft carriers for sure, but they can produce somewhere around 1,300 anti-carrier missiles for the price of one U.S. aircraft carrier. 1,300 to 1 is not a ratio that I like. So they are approaching our national security preeminence very intelligently. They are also obviously a major rising economic power. But I think that at the end of the day, what Americans have to remember is that this is not just an economic competition, not just a national security competition, but fundamentally a competition for values. And whoever wins this race will set the terms, the norms for governance the world over for decades, if not the next century to come. China has a very authoritarian system, and they are working hard to export that to other nations around the globe. Just before the pandemic, I traveled to Africa to see where China is working on the front lines to win over allies that we used to count on. And they're doing it with technology, they're doing it with a system of government, they're doing it with investments, but it's all in the name of expanding their model of government, which is an authoritarian state. So the stakes here are very high. And because it is a fundamental clash of values, I think the propensity for this to ultimately turn into more of a hot war is very real. What we have to focus on right now, though, is ultimately how do we beat China at these races in biotech, quantum, AI, with the ultimate goal of deterrence. The concluding lines of our Future Defense Task Force report are that we have to ensure the future of our defense so that we can ensure the future of peace. And let's not forget that that is ultimately the goal here, deterrence. Unfortunately, given the pace at which China is modernizing, we have a lot of work to do. When we did this report, one of the bipartisan conclusions we made right up front was, this isn't a race that we are at risk of losing. This is a race that we are losing today. And unless we make some major changes in how we prioritize our defense budget, we will lose to China.
And just to follow up, isn't it possible that the investment in China's military and the growth of its military is so that China will be taken seriously on the world stage, that perhaps they are not preparing for a hot war with the United States? Mira, I'd like to ask you, what do you see as the potential flashpoints, either respond to what I just said, but also do you think there are flashpoints that could lead to a hot war?
Well, I believe there are. I mean, I'm quite concerned about what we saw in Hong Kong this year. I mean, I think President Xi is far more aggressive than his predecessors. They have a very clear plan, whether it's how they're going to acquire technology, so they make their so-called Made in China 2025 goals. They've put their policy of civilian and military development into civil-military fusion. Is what their approach is, so that everything, the commercial side, can either develop itself, steal, or get illicitly. They put towards military goals. And I think we need to be concerned about Taiwan and the South China Sea and the buildup there. It's going to be critical for the next administration, whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, to continue to put the resources into advanced technologies, advanced weaponry, but also into a very active diplomacy with countries in the region. The relationship with India is going to remain critical. The relationship has expanded, it's strengthened. That needs to continue. Japan, South Korea, always important. And I think we've seen some very good trends of both of them, especially Japan, doing so much more to increase its own military capability. There has to be very close coordination, very strong diplomatic efforts to avoid hot points turning into something that we didn't expect. And I do think, to Congressman Moulton's point, we need to look at what China's doing elsewhere in the world, either through their One Belt, One Road initiative, which has essentially held out money and loans in return for what turns out to be influence in those countries. We need to be concerned about that as well. And finally, I do think that you could have a situation as well where military exercise, the test of an anti-satellite weapon actually accidentally hitting one of our satellites or one of our allies' satellites, and that could trigger some response as well that would have to be very well carefully managed.
Secretary Johnson, is it possible that we are creating a bogeyman out of China, and that in fact more engagement is needed as opposed to less? Is it possible that even the Belt and Road Initiative, we've seen it's hit some, it's stumbled in places because what China is selling to populations around the world, they aren't necessarily buying in terms of culture and values and autocratic rule. Is there too much groupthink that China is the great threat and that we're heading to a hot war?
Very good question. So, as I was listening, I was thinking to myself what I kind of already know from my own national security experience. I think that it is still the case that an overall nation's strength and prowess and prominence on the world stage is measured by, in part, its defense capabilities, its military, its conventional military capabilities. We still measure a nation's strength by that, including our own. I also believe that we are, as a world, moving away from conventional nation against nation hot wars. The conflicts that we, the United States, have been engaged in over the last 20 years have been against unconventional non-state actors, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, so forth. And the conflicts that we see on the world stage now tend to be in the form of covert warfare, warfare by proxies, cyber warfare. That is principally the engagement that exists between us and Iran right now. In January, we were all concerned that we may be on the verge of a hot war with the government of Iran. That didn't happen. What I suspect has happened, and I don't have access to intel anymore, obviously, is that we simply have reverted back to the form of conflict with Iran that we've been engaged in now for years, from the days when I was at the Pentagon. With China, our relationship is multifaceted. There is the conventional national security threat. There is the cyber relationship, and then there's the big fish in the pond is the economic relationship. And in evaluating the threats from China and evaluating the relationship with China, you have to include that as well. We are the two great global economic powers at the moment, and we are both in a position to hurt each other and help each other economically. And I think that's the thing that we have to be focused on principally here. I think we always have to be prepared for a hot war of the conventional type, but the way I see it, we are moving into much more subtle forms of global conflict and warfare.
And Dimitri, do you think we need more treaties to deal with, international treaties to deal with cyber, like we had with nuclear weapons during the Cold War? And is that realistic? Do you see any efforts moving on that front?
I don't see a lot of progress on the cyber treaties themselves. I do think that, to Mira's point, we need to build closer relationships with our allies. When it comes to the South China Sea region and beyond, we really need Vietnam, Indonesia, India, South Korea, Japan, Australia, all those parties to help us, not just in the military sense, but also in the economic sense. And the problem that we've had on the trade issues, of course, is that the Chinese have been able to subvert multilateral institutions like the WTO and make them essentially ineffective. So I think that we should be thinking about sort of an economic version of NATO, not necessarily focused on Europe itself, but perhaps on the Asia Pacific, and thinking about how do we develop a new form of relationship that does not include the whole world and specifically excludes China and is able to counterbalance the economic rise of China.
And in terms of the cyber world and tech dependency, in terms of our being so interconnected with China and maybe dependent in some ways, Dimitri, how do we think about keeping open borders when it comes to tech and Chinese students coming to the U.S. and sharing technological innovation? Or is this a time where the U.S. needs to rethink that?
Jennifer, I personally believe that ship has sailed, and it actually sailed a long time ago, because the reality is, there's a lot of concern, of course, right now because of the administration's policies about balkanization of the internet. The reality is that the internet has been balkanized for years. The Chinese have deployed their Great Firewall back in the late 90s, early 2000s to essentially separate themselves from the rest of the world and control information coming in. The Russians are doing the same, the Iranians, and many, many others. The idea that the internet will continue as this sort of free form of communication across nations, that's just not going to happen. And the Chinese are actively working in organizations like the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, to put forward their own standards on technologies that enables authoritarian governments to control information and censor information within their own borders, make it easier to turn off the internet for their populace, as we're now seeing in Belarus, for example, as the protests there are taking place. So the reality is that the internet is becoming balkanized, and we need to make sure that we bring as many countries as possible into our own sphere and promote our own values of open communication and freedom of speech and other values that we hold dear.
And Congressman Moulton, how would you restructure the defense budget, which has obviously ballooned in recent years for various reasons? How would you restructure it to face these emerging threats? What did your bipartisan commission come up with?
Actually, it's such an important question. Let me just respond also real quickly to what Dimitri just said, because again, one of our principal recommendations is that we do develop a totally new generation of alliances. That alliances are one of our strengths in America, but we have to modernize them, and in some cases, fundamentally rethink them to meet this rising threat. There's an interesting article coming out in Foreign Affairs about an argument for sort of a techno alliance based on technological capability of nations and commitment to democratic values, as opposed to based on geography. So I think that's a really key point. And to tie that to the second point he made, the balkanization of the internet, we have this big debate about how much we should be decoupling from China, or how much we even can if we wanted to. That plays into that, and that's something that strategically we really need to figure out as a country. But to your next question, we also need to strategically figure out as a country how we are going to invest more in these emerging technologies for defense at a time when we just don't have more money. And defense budgets are flattening to begin with. It's only exacerbated by the pandemic. What we've recommended is that we bring in an outside commission led by an organization like RAND to do a very serious analysis of our existing budget, our commitments to legacy platforms, and recommend some tough cuts. And this is going to be hard because, as John McCain said, we have a military-industrial congressional complex that keeps many of these expensive, old, big legacy programs that are not really meant for a new world of threats. They keep them going because they're jobs in congressional districts. So we have to come together as a Congress and a country to cut those old programs in order to make room for emerging technologies. We need to be investing way more in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, in biotechnology, even from the Department of Defense. And we're only going to be able to do that if we cut these legacy systems.
And Mira, looking back at your time at the NSC, what were you working on that you left undone, or that you wished you had been able to accomplish while you were there?
Well, I think, and it gets back to kind of what we've all been talking about, that we just need a strategy and a vision to go forward, especially to deal with China. I think we were able to identify key areas to address, whether it be IP theft, foreign direct investment with the update of the CFIUS process, export controls. Those things were on a good track, but kind of an overall vision of what we want that relationship to be with China and how we deal with the complexities of the supply chains. I mean, there's a lot of talk about decoupling in the wake of the pandemic. You can decouple on paper, but the reality is that globalization brought the U.S. and Chinese economies so closely together and integrated them in so many ways that we don't even know the impacts to some of the things that are proposed, whether it's in executive orders or not. I mean, I think we've been able to figure out where the priorities are in terms of some of the things we have to secure, like telecommunications supply chain. But there's a lot more work to be done in terms of prioritizing the objectives vis-a-vis China, and really saying, okay, what is it? What is that vision that we have of the U.S.-China relationship, and how are we going to get there?
Secretary Johnson, how would a Biden administration deal with China in comparison to a second term of a Trump administration?
That's interesting. I think that a Biden administration, to the extent that it reflects what I am used to from the Obama administration, is they would view the relationship with China in the way I described it earlier. I think they would see it as multifaceted and complex, and that a number of things have to be taken into account in evaluating responses to particular events. There are some events that are game changers, and you have to look at them that way, but I think the best way to view a relationship with a nation as vast as China is multifaceted, and that includes the economic aspects of our relationship relationship, as well as the national security aspects, as opposed to viewing relationships with other large nations as transactional, which I believe the current administration tends to do, in that you have a series of steps taken as bargaining tools to achieve an ultimate result. I think the way to view a relationship like the one we have with China is you've got to consider a number of things, and you've got to have a larger, longer-term picture in mind.
And Dmitry, we only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to give you, something you've talked a lot about is that more needs to be done to secure our election infrastructure. Can you give us some examples?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to happen is a realization that the states and municipalities need a lot of help. The reality is that our system is not a federalized system of elections, and it's not even a 50-state system of elections, because in many, many jurisdictions across this country, the local county election supervisors are their own constitutional offices that even the Secretary of State in that particular jurisdiction doesn't control. So a lot of these organizations rely on volunteers to do security, or people without a lot of cyber expertise, and that's where the federal government needs to come in. CISA, the cybersecurity agency under DHS, is doing a lot to try to help them, but it needs more funding, and it needs more, frankly, authorities from Congress to be able to do its job better. So we need to realize that this is a team sport, and no one agency can solve it alone, and we all need to work together, private sector, local municipalities and jurisdictions, and federal government to have an effect. And the most important thing, I think, is we need to really figure out how do we deter the threat actors, foreign threat actors at least, that are trying to interfere in our elections. We have not figured it out. I think that it's a mistake to constantly rely on sanctions. A lot of our adversaries, particularly Iran and North Korea and to some extent Russia, have already been sanctioned to death, and additional sanctions really add zero value in terms of deterrence. And we need to find other pressure points that we can bring to bear on those regimes to show that too can play this game, and we too can inflict tremendous amount of hurt on them should they continue these nefarious activities.
And with about 5 minutes left to our great panel today, I'd like to go around the horn, and if in 1 minute or less, each panelist could give our audience some homework, something to think about, something to do as we think about these emerging threats. Congressman Milken, if you could start.
Well, we spent an awful lot of time talking about China and election security, two topics that are in some ways related, but in other ways independent. The homework for the next few weeks has to be election security. And part of that is simply confidence in the election system that we have. We've made a lot of progress, as Dmitry pointed out, since 2016. It's not a perfect system, but we do know things like mail-in ballots are perfectly secure. When I was in Washington last 2 weeks ago, we got a classified briefing on election security. And without getting into the classified details, I will tell you I was very impressed by the work going on within the executive branch, the FBI and other agencies, to ensure the security of our elections and to make sure that American people know when there are threats from overseas and that are real and when they're not. But implicit throughout the entire conversation was that what they see is one of the greatest threats to the security of our election and ultimately to the success of our democracy in the next few months is the threat coming from within, specifically the disinformation campaign from the President of the United States. We all need to recognize that for what it is, and we all need to do our part to ensure that we do have a safe and fair election, that every ballot is counted, and that the basic norms of our democratic government persist through the next year.
Mira, homework?
So I would like there to be more thought about who benefits from the divisions in our country, what countries, what actors, what players benefit from political divisiveness and from a lack of confidence in our electoral process. And I think that's particularly important because our democracy is not only an inspiration to many millions and probably across this globe and has been the beacon for much of the world. And if we lose confidence in it, then others will too, and will not be able to continue their struggle towards freedom in those places where they don't have it. So again, we need to make sure that we understand that there are adversaries, China, Russia, who want to destabilize our democracy and other democracies, and we need to think about that before assuming that that everything that is going on is all from within.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson.
Jennifer, the Ronald Reagan Institute just asked me to write an essay about President Reagan's farewell address to the nation on January 11th, 1989. And he talked about a number of things, but one of the things I was struck by that he talked about was the importance of informed patriots. And I think that's very much in the spirit of what we've been discussing today. I think that it's important in the days leading up to this election specifically that everyone listening tell everyone else they know to be informed about our democracy, how it works, how the truth about mail-in voting, the truth about in-person voting, and the truth about the positions that the candidates are espousing and stand for, and the merits of each candidacy. I think it's critical that in this democracy, with the misinformation hysteria going on, that Americans take the time to be informed about their choices.
Thank you. And Dimitri, I'll give you the last word. We have about 30 seconds left.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to echo the comments on elections. The reality is that you can't hack paper. It's the most secure way that we can vote, either in person or by mail. And one of the things that some legislatures can do actually practically to ensure that this period after the election is not as contentious as we fear is to start counting ballots early. The reality is that a few states, like particularly Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, by law prevent counting of absentee and mail-in ballots until the day of the election, pretty much ensuring that they won't know the result of the vote on the night of the election. The legislators can do something now to change that law and to enable counting early so that we will know on the night of who won the presidency.
Well, I want to thank my panel, and it was a great discussion. And my bit of homework to our audience is for everyone to watch The Social Dilemma if they have not done so. And if you have teenage kids particularly, you need to watch it. So with that, thank you, panelists, and thank you for watching today.